Is this on? Yeah. And my slides are going to appear, are they? Oh, they're there. Blimey. Or are they? Right. Good afternoon, everyone. After lunch, we've just heard a splendid talk from Nav to wake you up and well, not to wake you up, that's the wrong term, but to keep you really thinking about the challenges and the issues around suicide prevention and issues around language. And in my 14 and a half minutes I've got left, I want to talk also about language and the language of money and the language of communicating about economics around the area of suicide prevention and self-harm prevention. And you might think, my God, why on earth do we want to talk about money? Life is precious. You can't put a price on life. And you can't. I don't care how many economists say you cannot value life. It has infinite value. But the reality is that decision-making does use economics in all areas of public policy, okay? And so one of my take-homes at the very beginning is that if you fail to use economic arguments when you're putting forward the case for all aspects of suicide and self-harm prevention, then I don't think you're doing justice to yourselves. Because decision-makers, budget holders within the healthcare system, out with the healthcare system, will be looking at these arguments as well. And so they are uncomfortable arguments, but they are important arguments to make. And you'll find this slide controversial maybe as well, because it's basically saying that we don't have unlimited resources. And this is a typical thing economists say, that resources are limited and we have to make choices, etc., etc. But that is the reality. I mean, there's an election going on here in the UK at the moment, and there's lots of discussions about how money is going to be spent, but there are tough choices to be made, whoever forms the next government. We can't afford to do everything. So we do need to choose. And as I say, you may argue that we're making the wrong choices, but choices will always have to be made. And I would argue very strongly that we can use economic arguments to really justify greater investment in suicide prevention, self-harm prevention, because it makes economic sense as well as being a profoundly important thing to do. I mean, there's an overwhelming moral case to take action, okay? But I would argue, as an economist who does have lived experience in my wider family of suicide, that there is an economic argument that we can make and should make as well. And I would really say that we have, myself and other colleagues, we really have, through using economic arguments in a number of countries, actually influenced implementation, policy and practice, nudge things towards more resources being provided for mental health in general. I think we have made a difference, and I think it's important to make these arguments. But it is about the way you communicate this. It is not about trying to save money. It's not about bean counting. It's not accountancy. It's about showing the economic value of life and the values to families of avoiding all the horrible things that we heard about this morning from 2 of the 3 dads. All these things. What sort of things should you think about? I think there are 4 questions, really, that really can look at. The costs of not taking action. Not doing anything to address suicide is not a cost-free activity. You all know that, but it has economic costs as well. But it is also important to know how much strategies and interventions cost. And you will be surprised how often it's difficult to find information on that. It's nothing worse for a budget holder if they don't know how much an investment, how much a strategy is going to cost. So it's really important to know about that, the resources required, the types of skills, etc., to do that. Then there's the whole business of economics in terms of cost effectiveness. I'll talk about that briefly. And then we can also think about other things, financial incentives. And I think one thing, well, again, I'll come back to that later, but I think we really have to move beyond just looking at healthcare systems and think about addressing the wider socioeconomic determinants of health. So we can't afford to ignore the economic and I would say the human costs of suicide and self-harm. And I just highlight one example, which is recent work I did for the Samaritans here in the UK. So apologies again, a lot of UK stuff I will show you, where we estimated that the costs are around £10,000 million per annum for the cost of suicide. I mean, these numbers are enormous, and sometimes we can get bogged down in the size of the numbers. Some estimates, I mean, we've estimated here it's around about £1.5 million per suicide. I previously estimated it was 1.6 million a few years ago, and it's gone down. So people say, oh, why has it gone down? But don't worry about that. The more important thing is we can identify substantial, profound costs to society of suicide. So if we can avoid some of these suicides, there's a clear, strong economic argument for taking action. It's also important to recognise, though, with policymakers that the costs fall across many, many different sectors. And the biggest single cost of suicide is the loss of life. And the way we measure that is in two ways, typically. We think about time out of work. It's a very crude measure, but it's a way we can value lost time across a lifetime. And we can also think about the value people put on the value of having life. And you can put a monetary value on that as well. And there are different ways of doing that. They are by far the biggest costs, but they don't necessarily turn into pounds or dollars for governments. So you have to be aware of that. So I would highlight a couple of important things to think about in addition to the costs of suicide themselves, and that's the cost of non-fatal self-harm, because that has a substantial cost to healthcare systems. And obviously, if you're dealing with self-harm, you're also dealing with suicide. But the point is, preventing self-harm makes economic sense to healthcare systems. And I would also highlight costs to other sectors. And I'm just highlighting one here, which is the medical legal system costs, the coronial costs, which are a bit of a mystery still. And in England, as far as I'm aware, families can often, well, not often, but they can, and there may be people in this room with lived experience of this, have to go through the coronial court process and legally represent themselves because there's no legal aid for this, and it can cost a lot of money. A lot of money to families, lots of money to local governments for the coronial process as well. So think broadly about costs, okay? And look at these arguments, but recognise that not all policymakers are going to be interested, sadly, in some aspects of these costs. They may be more interested in things that they feel are more tangible from their perspective, such as avoidance of cost to healthcare systems. So the slide we saw yesterday, I think it was Brian, but it may not have been Brian, it might have been somebody else, showing how there were fewer people going back to emergency departments after receiving an intervention. But it doesn't matter how much you know about the cost of suicide and self-harm if there aren't things we can do about it, okay? So we first of all need to know that things are effective, but then we also look at the cost effectiveness, spending money, investing in suicide prevention compared to other things we could do. So it's a simple thing, effectiveness, is it worth it? Everyone in this room will think it's worth it, for sure, but decisions are made by governments, by health funders, and others that they have to choose, and they use different ways of doing that. So what can we say about what we know about the economics of suicide prevention? This is some very broad data, but basically we know a lot about the cost effectiveness of a range of interventions, particularly talking therapies, psychological therapies, and a range of pharmacotherapies and suicide programs, and some other measures around restricting access to means. But what I think we don't know enough about, in addition to this, that's really important, is to go beyond the healthcare system, to look at the impacts of financial protection measures, to eviction protection, access to better housing, access to employment, dealing with uncertainty around jobs, job security, all these kinds of things. I think we need to know more about those. And it's a mixed picture in terms of what the evidence says at the moment. The positive news, very few studies that look at the cost effectiveness case for suicide prevention find it not to be cost effective, okay? About half find there to be a positive return on investment. Benefits valued having a greater value than costs. But there's an awful lot where, from a communication point of view, the information is difficult to use because the studies, when they're done, they're not using an outcome measure, a metric that's used by decision makers, like return on investment, like in some countries, the concept of quality adjusted life years saved, okay, or gained, it should be. If those measures aren't used, it's more difficult to make decisions because that's what's used to make other decisions in healthcare systems or cost-benefit analysis when you're comparing interventions outside of healthcare systems, such as in transport. And the other thing I would say, these are just messages. These are very quick because it's a panel rather than a long talk. The other thing is that, so I would say, yes, do all the great work you're doing on evaluating things that work or could work within healthcare systems, but don't overlook what's happening outside healthcare systems as well. And that can be difficult to evaluate, but it shouldn't be ignored because it's difficult. And think about the impacts, the economic impacts beyond healthcare systems as well, because the vast majority of the costs around suicide are not for healthcare systems. Therefore, as I said, lost productivity, loss of life, the impacts on families, these medico-legal costs that we don't know anywhere near enough about, yet we know for individual families they cost a lot. So think more about these other impacts as well, particularly because many of the interventions we're talking about are not funded by healthcare systems. You know, if you're restricting access or dealing with bridges, the Golden Gate Bridge is probably not going to be funded by the healthcare system in California. I might be wrong on that, but I doubt it. And certainly, so those things are very important. So think about these broader arguments. And also remember, when we're thinking about broader arguments as well, and this is going to sound like heresy, but you don't need to focus on suicide prevention. If we're talking about measures to deal with poverty, to deal with homelessness, to deal with job insecurity, yes, we can argue that they make a difference for suicide prevention, but they will make there will be other benefits as well. So why not make the broader case? Because that's going to help suicide prevention, and you'll build alliances and demonstrate there are other benefits. So that's where I come from. And I just very quickly, because I know I've got very little time left, I just want to give one example of why we need to think about socioeconomic risk factors. And this was actually mentioned yesterday when you spoke. And this is a nice study from Brazil, from the Bolsa Familia program. Diane Machado and colleagues did. It's a very, very, very big data set. So it's not a randomized controlled trial, but they use really good methods to try and look at the association between extra financial support for low-income families, to allow their children to go to a conditional cash transfer program, kids go to school, and that data set has data on suicides. And what they're able to see there is there's a strong association between receiving this extra financial support and lower risk of suicide. Okay? And I think that's a really good example of how social welfare protection can make a difference. And I would argue, but I've got no strong evidence to support it yet, that during the COVID pandemic, one of the reasons why perhaps we didn't see as bad an impact as we could have done is because of the substantial social welfare funding and other protective measures that were put in place to safeguard people during the pandemic. So I think doing more about that is very important. So just to wrap up, really, how to effectively make the case. I just want to give some advice on this. And one thing is, don't oversell it. Better to underestimate cost than overestimate. Just be cautious about that. And the same way, do the same with benefits as well. Be transparent. A lot of economic studies are modelling studies, and they're not always transparent in how things are calculated. Really think about, are there additional benefits beyond suicide and self-harm prevention? And in many cases, there will be. A lot of these interventions are about mental health. Tailor the message to the stakeholder. Think about what they're interested in. Different messages or different tailoring for healthcare system stakeholders versus the transport sector or schools or whatever. Build alliances, have many conversations, absolutely involving people with lived experience at the heart of them all the time. So, take home for the panel, my point, and I'll throw it over to Michael. I'm absolutely aware that no economic study will ever be able to represent the loss of life in a true way. But we can't ignore economics, however uncomfortable it makes us feel. There are profound economic as well as human consequences of suicide. And it's a kind of, if interventions are effective and they do prevent suicides, they have a very strong chance of being cost effective because of the magnitude of the impacts of suicide. So I'd argue really that however uncomfortable you in this room may feel, however distasteful it may be to talk about money, not talking about it would be a moral and ethical mistake, in my view, because I think using these arguments, we can strengthen the case for investing more in measures that will help you achieve your goals of self-harm and suicide reduction. I'll leave that for now and throw it over to Michael.